Hello and welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest, Hanson. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. I'm joined today, as usual, by clinical psychologist Rick Hanson. So, Dad, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Forrest. And as always, just happy to sit here with you.
Yeah, same. And also happy to be answering some questions from our listeners. This is another mailbag episode. If you would like to have a question answered on a future episode of the podcast, the best way to do that is by signing up for our Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And you can also send an email to contact@beingwellpodcast.com. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a quick reminder that Rick's got an online course coming up that's focused on his big core practice of taking in the good. It's usually easier for us to ruminate on the things that bother us than it is for us to notice and take in our more positive experiences. That's in part because of the brain's negativity bias. And in this course, Rick's helping people learn how to harness the power of positive neuroplasticity to get more confidence, motivation, and hey, maybe even a little inner peace. Learn more through the link in the description of today's episode and use coupon code BEINGWELL25 to receive a 25% off discount if you decide that you want to get the course. So, okay, let's get started here. We got awesome questions in this mailbag. I'm super interested in what you have to say about them, Rick. Sometimes I go into a mailbag and I've got like my mental 4-point plan for each of these questions. I do not have that today. So I'm kind of flying a little looser than normal with this because I just thought they were very interesting and evocative questions that don't necessarily have a really tight answer. Many of them kind of touch on this theme of like developmental stages in life and how to break through a kind of perfectionism that can keep us stuck. And that starts with our first question. So I'm a 20-something man, and I'm struggling to reconcile this strong sense I have of my potential with the fear, apathy, and resistance I experience when facing the realities of adult life. How can I move forward when I'm caught between this idealized future self and a fear of disappointment? And this person went on to mention that part of their struggle here, part of their hesitation, comes up from a kind of fear of desire or hope. Really wanting something opens them up to more vulnerability and disappointment, as we've talked about a bit on the podcast in the past. What do you think about this, Dad?
I'm listening to how I listen to these questions, which is kind of interesting. And I want to explain it a little bit for people who are listening to me, listen to how I'm listening to the question. And in other words, I'm listening here like a therapist. So I'm hearing this person, I'm listening past the words, I'm picking up on certain keywords, and you're trying to get a sense of that person's being behind the words, behind the eyes. That's what we really listen for. So I'm really struck by this person's emphasis on the future, and they're veering away from the present. So words like the strong sense I have of my potential. And I find myself wondering immediately, what's your sense of your actual here and now? Not your potential, your actual. Who are you as a person? What's it like to be you much of the time? Do you have good intentions? Do you have a good heart? What are your actual capabilities in the present? What's your actual? And I think right there, that would be helpful for this person to be appreciative, kind of an appreciative inquiry, to use that phrase that's well known now, an appreciative inquiry of your own actual, distinct from potential, right? And I have a hunch that in this person's actual is a fair amount of emotional history in which they maybe fell short or were criticized for not getting an A again. And they've built up kind of an emotional memory bank of negative experiences of trying and not quite succeeding. There are many people, I grew up in that way myself. My parents, my mom in particular, had really high performance expectations. And so if I did well in school, she would say, oh, I expected that. If I did, I missed one question in 20 on a math homework, she'd say, why'd you miss that one question, Rick? So there was only a downside, related to any awareness of how I was actually performing. So maybe there's something like that. So that's what I would be wondering for starters. What's in the present? What's in the actual? Let's come into the present. Let's explore the present, because clearly this preoccupation with the future, which by the way is very self-saturated, there's also a lot of selfing in here. Comparison to others, wanting to appease the inner audience, and to propitiate the angry gods inside by impressing them or proving oneself again and again. Well, that's very self-referential too. Okay, those are two thoughts off the top. How about you? What's your take on this?
Sometimes for the mailbag, I shorten down the questions a little bit just for the sake of time and clarity. And maybe this is because I got kind of more the full picture that was in the longer form question. But what really stood out to me in it was what I'll call gifted kid syndrome. This is something that I've had to struggle with a lot in my life,
Yeah,
and I've talked to a
yeah.
lot of friends roughly my age, kind of millennials or younger millennials, who were labeled bright, talented, or gifted early on in life. And they were really sold the sun and the moon and the stars by how people kind of talked to them about what was going to happen. Everybody was going to grow up to be an astronaut and change the world, right?
That's right.
And now they feel kind of paralyzed by this perception of a gap between that perceived potential that was really emphasized throughout their entire academic experience. And then they pop out into the real world, and there is this brutal realization that A, there are an awful lot of smart people on the planet,
Mm-hmm.
and B, no one really cares anymore. And I mean that kind of in a general way, that just normal people moving through the world are not as invested in your personal development as your parents were.
Yeah.
The company that you work for is not as invested in like getting the most out of you and really recognizing the bright spark that lies within us all as maybe your parents were or your teachers were or whatever it is. And I just think we really did a lot of people dirty through how we talked to them about this, which obviously came from a really good place. It really came from this place of wanting to build people up and tell them how, what a special snowflake they were and all of that. So anyways, that's kind of like context on how I think about this. And when you are really closely identified with your potential, trying is a risk.
Mm.
Kind of like you were talking about, Dad, like coming into the present is a risk because you can only be disappointed if you try. If you never really try, you can always tell yourself the story that you could have succeeded if you had just tried. There's no identity threat there. So you can have an identity of being a gifted person who also is just kind of a little bit lazy. Like that was my identity for a long time. And there was something in the laziness that was protective of the gifted kid identity. I couldn't like disprove it.
Oh, yeah. The protection, like in my example, of fear of criticism, basically. And
Totally, yeah.
by standing out, I would become vulnerable then to
Yeah.
a shaming attack of some kind.
Absolutely. And so I'm wondering how you've seen people kind of work with that or move through that.
I think of kind of like a mid-level intervention and then a deep intervention. So mid-level intervention would be to help yourself, to resource yourself so you're more willing to risk the dreaded experience, as we talk about, in very, very careful graduated steps. So let's suppose here's a person who wants to avoid risking the dreaded experience of disappointment or the dreaded experience of being criticized by other people or dreaded experiences of going into situations where he's with other capable people and he's no longer a star on the team. Right. So then what a person would do is think, okay, what inner psychological strengths would help me deal with those experiences of disappointment or social comparison or being criticized? So how can I grow those experiences in a step-by-step way? This is a quick summary of our book, Resilient. And then on the basis of growing them, how can I take small risks that go well, usually, and when they go well, I can internalize the results and gradually push back the bars of my invisible cage. Okay, that's a bit of a shtick people who listen to the show may have heard before, but it's really, really good advice. And it's just what I'd call a middle level intervention. Now, the deeper level intervention.
That's pretty good middle level intervention, Dad. You're coming in with some gas. Go ahead.
Okay. I always like it when the youngins appreciate when the old guys are coming in
the ancient wisdom
coming in
of the
hot.
previous generation, right? God, not to opine about this. Maybe we should do a whole episode about this sometimes. I guess I'm just a little loose today or something. But like all of that, this is going to get, oh my God, I can't believe I'm talking about this.
Go for it.
Into so much trouble. You know that I don't even know if I want
Do
to
it.
talk about this.
Do
Okay,
it.
all right. You know, like all those online programs or whatever that like the phrase ancient wisdom is
Yeah, I've
used to
used
just,
it myself.
I think you've used it yourself, even talking
Oh
about
yeah.
Buddhist practice.
Hey,
Yeah.
I
Oh my
coined it.
God.
I coined it.
Oh, you really
Oh,
did. God, I'm talking to the source of the
come
problem
on.
right now.
Okay. All right.
Man, the phrase ancient wisdom just kind of gets me. I don't know why. But just in general, I think it's kind of overused and corny and whatever. But it's funny to think of the idea of like the ancient wisdom is actually the boomers. You know, it's your generation, Dad. You're
Oh,
the ancient wisdom to me. We don't have to go 2,000 years into the time bank for this one.
that's what I'm talking
I could
about.
just look down the street. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah. I'm talking about ancestral lineages. I'm talking about great
Totally.
teachers. Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks
yeah.
for sharing. Yeah. But that's right.
No,
Ancient
sorry, I
wisdom.
didn't mean to just like complain and opine for a minute, but you know,
No, my
I gotta.
72-year-old dad, ancient. Fuck you.
It's all right. You got a lot of tread left on your tires, Dad. Don't worry.
Well,
You'll be pushing that rock up the hill a little longer
well,
yet.
we
But
hope
okay,
so.
go
But
ahead.
honestly, there's a lot of
You
value
never
in
know.
living in a way that you're ready for the lights to go out.
Wow. Way to just like hit me with that one. I'm gonna go to
That's
bed at
some
night and
ancient
just staring
wisdom
at the
for you.
ceiling. Yeah, that's some ancient wisdom right there. All right, okay, Dad. Deep level, deep level. Sorry, I just totally derailed us. I couldn't help myself.
Okay, good. Well, I think in a way, a deeper intervention is to get out of the frame of the future. This person's really in the frame of the future. I'm hearing a lot of ruminating about the future, and that's very much the nature of the brain, especially in the default mode network, the ruminator doing mental time travel. We're imagining different futures, and that's what a lot this person is doing, which have the function of moving away from the present, derailing useful action, and avoiding various dreaded experiences bubbling away under the surface. I would invite this person to come into not the potential, but the actual of your own abilities, your own capacities, and the actual of where your passions really lie. Again, words. I was very struck by the oddball word when this person named fear, apathy, and resistance. And for me, the oddball in those three words, the one that stood out next to the two, was apathy. I get fear and resistance. That's very functional, right? Resisting dreaded experience. Apathy. That's a really interesting word. Now, sometimes apathy has a defensive purpose because it helps us avoid risks of dreaded experiences. But very often it's present because we just really don't care. And so I'm immediately wondering about the so-called idealized future self. Maybe the person's apathetic because they're living out the agendas of other people that they've internalized, or the various shoulds of the shiny, super duper treasure island kind of life they're supposed to have that they actually don't care much about. What do you actually care about in the present? In other words, what's the actual of what it's like to be you and your actual capabilities and your actual passions? And if you find the actual passions, then you're not apathetic, and you don't care so much about the results. You get much more focused on process, intrinsic goals, which I think were kind of implicit in what you were saying, and you might have more about that. But if you really care about it, if you love doing X, it'd be nice to be super successful at X, but it's less important. The less you care about doing X, the more important extrinsic rewards are, like status and fame and fortune and money. So find what you really care about in the actual of who you deeply are.
That's a really great point, Dad. I gotta give the ancient
For an
wisdom
old
some
guy.
credit for an old guy. That's that's a really good point for an old guy. I'm really excited to wear this joke out by the end of the episode. But no, I think it's truly a great point. And what you were saying a second ago about the kind of everydayness of it, the process focus, I think is a huge piece of this. So one really good version of process focus is, do I like what I'm doing? And that's what you're bringing to here. Like the more that you enjoy what you're doing, the less it becomes about doing it for the sake of fill in the blank. And it becomes less about that and more about the joy of the process itself. And there's probably my favorite line from that I've ever heard related to Buddhist practice is before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water.
Wow.
I think it's a beautiful line. And there's something in the chop wood, carry water of it all
Yeah.
that has really started to speak to me. Maybe it's because I too am becoming an old man. Um, and in my 37-year-old dotage, I've started to kind of enjoy the everyday acts of things, or like find more
Yeah.
pleasure in these little moments of engagement, feeling more of like being in the present with what it is that I'm doing. And that's a kind of natural antidote to the moving into the future that, to your point, is like all over this question, right? There's so much preoccupation with the future. And okay, how can we kind of bring you more and more into what's happening right now? Find a little bit more enjoyment in that, even in the mundanity of it, even in the boring everyday. So you're a little bit less preoccupied with this sense of needing to build the pyramids in order to be a successful person in life.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Great,
All
great
right.
question. Love these questions. Next question. I've been living abroad for 10 years and I've learned the local language. Though I've made good progress, I still feel very shy about speaking. My perfectionism and self criticism kicks in. I notice my mistakes and sometimes I just freeze. In a few months, I will start a psychotherapy course that will require speaking this language at a high level daily. And I'm terrified. Do you have any tips on overcoming this performance anxiety?
Well, I can relate. As you know, I lived in Finland for my junior year in high school and went to a Swedish language boys' school because a certain edge of Finland near Sweden, uh, many people, uh, many people there speak Swedish as their native tongue. So, um, I actually got fairly good at Swedish, but I was very shy about speaking it. Performance anxiety is a huge topic. There's a lot about it. There's the factors underneath it all, like imposter syndrome, perfectionism, self referentiality. We tend to watch ourselves and then we tend to perform, not so well. So, what do you do about that? Right. And, uh, I obviously practice helps. Reframing the purpose, what's your purpose there? Is it to connect with others? Is it to be generous and large-hearted? Is it to find the good in them? My one suggestion would be to shift your focus away from yourself in your classes into how can I see good in others, even if they speak the language fluently because it's their native tongue, they too are grappling with feelings of inadequacy, their own concerns about performance. How can I be supportive of them? How can I be a kind person who maybe garbles a word or two every so often and has an accent? Right? How can I be over there? That will tend to move you out of yourself, and it'll actually help your speaking to become more fluent and fluid. I like the phrase "play a game you can win at." So sometimes
Mm-hmm.
we're in situations where we cannot succeed in terms of the obvious goals, but we can redefine the game into something we can win at. So tennis, like I'd be a poor tennis player, say, and I'd be playing someone who was patient with me and much better. I would be interested. Can I get 1 point? I'll never win a game, let alone a set, but can I win a point? Or I'm never going to win a point, but can I improve my backhand? Can I learn something along the way, including it's a shift into process goals distinct from outcome goals. So, with regard to being in an environment in which you're nervous about speaking in a language that's not native to you, how would you redefine the game, as it were? How do you redefine your goals into ones you can actually succeed at? That's an example broadly. That's a broad principle on which my example of focusing on being large hearted, caring, and supportive of others would be useful to you because that's something you can definitely succeed at.
That's a great point, Dad. And I think my primary advice would be the very simple functional advice that I'm sure this person has gotten. Can you do the kind of low stakes practice inside of this language that might support you in what you're trying to do? Can you learn the vocabulary associated with this particular discipline that you want to become more proficient at, and just make sure you've kind of checked your boxes there. I also wonder about something called non corrective practice. Most of the time when we practice, we have a running thing that's going in the back of our minds that's focused on correction. So we have a frame that we're entering into with the person that we're practicing with of mutual correction. Hey, am I doing this okay? Does this feel good to you? Did that make sense? And we sort of expect inside of that, we're both signing up for being corrected by the other person. Oh, you said this, you really should have said that. Well, that creates a certain model of conversation for a person. it creates a model of we're here to correct each other and we're here to like focus on improvement as opposed to focusing on some of the other things that we actually mentioned in the first question, focusing on enjoyment, focusing on fulfillment. What are the things you're trying to actually really get out of this? And so I wonder about that as a kind of tool that might over time help to start kind of decouple this self evaluation that is really leading to a lot of distress for this person from the activity that they're doing. If every time that they engage this activity or the majority of times that they engage in it, they're expecting a degree of criticism, that can already kind of get in the way of some stuff here. The other thing I would just mention is how can we change the target from speaking really well to whatever it is that you're trying to actually get out of this thing. Can people understand you? Can you make progress on this course? Are you getting what you need to get out of this? Understanding that everyone's going to make some mistakes, kind of the common humanity of it all of those little bits and pieces. So I would wonder about all of those parts as well.
That's great, Forrest. I'm just reflecting on, is there any last thing I could offer? And there is a last thing.
Okay.
Actually,
We love
small.
the last thing.
Well, it has to do with the nature of communicating. And classic lines like, people will always forget what you say. They will never forget how you made them feel. And I'm thinking of Deborah Tannen's point about communicating, including the explicit content, second, the emotional tone, and third, a statement about the paradigm or framework in which the relationship is living, particularly related to aspects of power. And maybe a way to think about it too is that the words and your accent and your bungled grammar from time to time, that's really secondary. So much of what we communicate is in body language, emotional tone, the stance that we're in, the frame that we're in the relationship. That's what really matters. And maybe that's a lot of what there is to focus on.
And that's kind of the purpose of language, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to communicate with other people, and a huge part of that is sharing the feeling that's associated with it. So
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, great place to leave that question. And we can move on to our third one. I feel like I was conditioned into learned helplessness as a child, and it's easy for me to experience the freeze state. What can I do to work on this? So, before we get into it, quick note, we did a whole episode on all of the stress responses, including the freeze response. The part of this question that I was really interested in, Dad, was the learned helplessness part. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that in particular.
Well, if you like, I could offer a very quick summary of how the original research in learned helplessness by Martin Seligman and others
Yeah, there might be something in there that people can get or learn from. I think that'd be great.
which will enable me to make some general points.
Yeah.
Recently, Dr. Seligman has kind of restated his paradigm, but in my view, the essential matters remain. In other words, a person acquires a sense of futility, entrapment, and defeat, and then they generalize that into other situations in their life and what to do about that. So really, really briefly, and I'm going to describe research on dogs that occurred 30 or 40 years ago, long before much more stringent ethical standards. Very briefly, there was a training phase and then a testing phase. I'm simplifying and summarizing a whole line of research with many, many academics besides Martin Seligman. Essentially, during the training phase, dogs would be randomly assigned to the A group and the B group. They'd be brought in as pairs. So you'd have the A1, B1 dog, the A2, B2 dog, matched pairs. And they'd be brought into identical training booths that had a metal floor. They'd be brought in, the door would be closed, everything was identical, the A group and the B group. A light would start flashing, a bell would start ringing, and then some seconds later, let's say 10 seconds, there would be an unpleasant electrical shock on the metal floor of the cage. Well, the dogs had no idea what was going on. They would thrash. There was a big button in the cage, right at shoulder height for a dog. And one of the dogs would hit that button and it would turn off the electric shock in both cages. So the amount of aversive experience, the amount of so-called punishment that the dogs experienced was exactly the same. The only difference was the button did not work in the B group cage. And after several trials, the A group and the A1 dog and the B1 dog and so forth would be brought in. the bell would start ringing. The A1 dog would just bump the button and would prevent the shock before it actually occurred. At that point, the matched pair were then brought into the testing phase. So you can follow the training phase so far. In the testing phase, the notion was that, well, because they'd had this training, the B group dogs would be more helpless, as in the ways that dogs are. They wouldn't learn that quickly how to deal with the challenge. So the challenge in the training phase, probably the testing phase, was a different kind of a pen, more like a long rectangle with a barrier in the middle. And one floor was metal and the other side was not. So they would bring the dogs in and they'd put them in the metal side. The bell would start to ring. And then 10 seconds later, their side of the barrier would be electrified. The first time that happened, the A group dogs would look around and jump over the barrier to safety. After one or two of those events, they'd be brought in. The bell would start to ring. They would jump over the barrier before their side of the cage was electrified. Fine. Then when they brought the B group dogs in, the trained in helplessness dogs, first of all, they looked, as the researchers said, the dog equivalent of human depression. They were not hungry. They were not interested in sex. They looked dispirited. They were mopey. They would startle. They were traumatized. Any little thing. They just were not happy dogs. The A group dogs were just typical dogs. They'd had a stressful experience, but they beat it. They overcame it during the training phase. And so in the testing phase, they were still happy-go-lucky dogs. So now they bring the B group dogs in and they electrify their side of the testing rectangle, expecting them maybe to jump over the barrier more slowly. They didn't jump at all. They just lay there and
accepted
whimpered.
their fate. Yeah.
They just whimpered. It was really sad. And on the whole psychology of what it was like for the researchers to be doing this experiment, that's a whole other conversation. The researchers thought, wow, okay, let's get rid of the barrier. No barrier, just a painted line across, the long rectangle. Bring them in, same thing. Bell rings, electricity comes. It's unpleasant, not horrible, but it's unpleasant. They just lie there and whimper. They don't like it. They don't even get up to walk across a line. The researchers were amazed. They said, okay, let's just start dragging the dogs across. So they'd walk into the room with rubber boots and rubber gloves. When the side was electrified where the B group dog was, they would haul them to safety. And they think, okay, they'll learn quickly. Dogs are smart. Nope. They had to haul them across that line many, many times, maybe dozens of times, maybe even more, to teach them that, actually, there was escape from a painful condition, or, you could do things to help yourself. So we see right here an example on steroids, or if you will, electrified, of the negativity bias, in which, one single or a small number of episodes of entrapment and defeat during the training phase needed to be overcome by many, many times as many positive experiences of efficacy, agency, and success. That's the fundamental structure. Now, in this case, to make another point, the neutral stimulus is a bell ringing or a light flashing, to which the dogs associated the expectation of pain and developed the dog equivalent of emotional reactions of trauma and fear. Okay. The problem for many humans is that in addition to developing learned helplessness about a particular situation, like your father or your mother or your older brother or some teacher in school, we very often tend to generalize learned helplessness to many more neutral stimuli and eventually life itself. Living becomes the neutral stimulus to which we've associated the response of learned helplessness. And so people then in general can be living with a low grade, if not a medium grade, freeze response in their autonomic nervous system that has actually become chronic. It's not just episodic in reaction to a particular trigger. It's, it's who I am. And because it's who I am, I don't notice it anymore. Okay, so I just wanted to lay that foundation, partly to, inform people, and then to use it as a frame in which we can talk about what can people do. So I'm pausing for.
Oh, sorry, Dad. Did you want to keep on going with what people can do, or do you want me to do a little commentary
Yeah,
or
yeah. I
anything?
want to make room for your commentary,
Oh, yeah,
and
well, thank you.
I want to
I do
bring
think
you
that
into the
my
room. I don't
hopefully
want to
the
make you
floor is
feel
yeah.
helpless.
Hey, we were just lined up for the same joke. I hope the floor in this room is not electrified. I think that all of my responses would flow naturally into like what can people do about this. The big takeaway from this is the obvious Rick Hanson point, which you've made 700 million times through your long career because you're extremely old, as we've talked about, which is that hello, you have to really do this over and over and
Yep,
over and over again, and it's
that's
going to
right.
feel like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. It's going to feel every single time like what you're doing is impossible and like it's only going to end in failure. And every time that you experience any kind of negative blowback from what you're doing, that is going to want to convince you that there is no point and you should just get off the ride. And this is a big problem for people because negative feedback is an inevitable part of life, no matter what we're doing. And I was talking with Kimberly Quinlan recently. She's an anxiety and OCD specialist. And I asked her a question that we get a lot, which is sort of implicit in this question in a way, which is what do you do when the exposure doesn't go well? What do you do when you're somebody who's got a little social anxiety and you try to be a little bigger in a group and you just feel like the group doesn't respond very positively to you? Like, wow, for somebody who has that learned helplessness framework, that would really naturally reinforce that feeling in this very, very strong way. And her response to it, I thought, was really wonderful, which is that there's this kind of mindset shift that happens over time as you do this sort of work, where it's not about not experiencing any anxiety or not experiencing any
Mm.
helplessness or whatever we're doing here. It's about understanding that that's part of the game. And what she is always really excited to hear from the people that she works with is not, I went a week and I didn't experience any anxiety. It's, I went a week and I experienced a ton of anxiety and I kept on going anyways. And that's what she thinks is really helps people kind of work through that feeling. And it really dovetails with what you're talking about here, Dad. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. I want to suggest three things right off the top.
Yeah.
See
Great.
what you think about them. First is to track the freeze response as a bodily state. That is very somatic and very much involving with the autonomic nervous system. Uh, People talk about shutdown in polyvagal theory, or the polyvagal framework developed by Steve Porges and others. Uh, People talk about excessive activation of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. This is the most ancient, speaking of, original branch of the nervous system, which helps us to rest and digest. That's good. But in the extreme, it becomes a kind of playing dead, which animals do to escape threats, and is a kind of freeze response. So it's very embodied. It's very bodily. Tune into the bodily aspects of this. Become aware of it. Know what it feels like. The sleepiness, the sense of de-energization, the slumping of mood that's associated with this, a feeling of dread even that just is inchoate, doesn't have a clear explanation. It's just all pervading. Know what that's like. By knowing what it's like, you'll get some breathing room from it. And over time you'll be able to master it, over time. A second suggestion related to this is to, as much as you can, look for opportunities to experience vitality. That's the opposite of the freeze state. Vitality for any reason, playing tennis or teasing your father or anything you want to do that gives you a sense of aliveness, largeness. The freeze response is about being small. It's often very associated with the shame response, which also is a kind of freezing as we knuckle under and we go small, often to propitiate aggression around us, like the alphas in our school or home, or 20 million years ago in our baboon troop. The movement against that is to be large, is to be big, to lift your chest, to wave your arms, which is what I'm doing right now, to create a sense of vitality. That's really important. And then the third suggestion I would have,
Can
yeah,
I jump in here
yeah,
for 1 second, Dad? Okay. As somebody starts to do that, and I have a
yeah,
little bit of personal experience with this, not because I was like a big freeze response guy, but
yeah,
because for me, various versions of, well, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but like the really quick version, as we've talked about a lot on the podcast, I got a lot of negative feedback from kids growing up about being
yeah.
big,
I
exuberant,
want to track them all down and
all
tell
of
them
that.
how wrong they were.
We're not going Taken style on this one, Dad. But
Oldguyspayback.com.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. Exactly,
Hashtag.
exactly. I have a hard time seeing you in the Liam Neeson role, but I appreciate
No, it's not
your
my
overall
style.
vibe here, pops. That's not
That
really
was
your
a
overall
heck of a
style.
movie,
Okay.
but anyway.
Anyways, as you go through that process of being bigger,
Yeah.
if that's something that's not comfortable for you for
Right.
whatever reason, you're pushing an edge. Um, it is really, really normal for that to feel A, incredibly dumb, and B, to activate some pretty complicated emotions that a person might be feeling inside of them.
Yeah.
Some shame, some disgust, weird feelings about their body, all of that kind of stuff.
Sure.
A great way to practice this is on your own.
Yeah.
On
Okay.
your own, in front of a mirror, be big in a safe space first, be loud in a safe space first, do it in the environment that's going to support you being able to do that. It's going to be hard enough to do it just on your own.
Yeah. Great
And a lot of
advice.
time what happens is that people put themselves in a position to fail by just dive bombing into the deep end of the pool without really learning how to swim first.
That's
So
right.
put on your floaties, do it in an environment that is conducive to being successful here. Anyways,
Yeah.
go ahead, Dad.
Oh, fantastic advice
Yeah.
for us. I'm really glad you said that. And set yourself up to win.
Yeah.
And also, if you are in situations where the people around you they don't want you to be big and they will hurt you if you take up space, obviously be very careful about that. All right. So, third suggestion, know what agency feels like in easy ways. There you are having a meal. Do you want the salt? Do you want more salt? Decide to reach for the salt. Know what it's like to see the salt. I want the salt. I'm going to get the salt. Reach for the salt, get the salt. Congratulate yourself for getting the salt. Know what that feels like. It's silly, it's small, it's simple, but that's a building block that can gradually, over time, develop a much greater sense of potency, that you're a cue ball, not the 8 ball, as you go through life. And then you can expand those examples of agency and efficacy into bigger and bigger things and take in the results along the way, the sense of yourself as someone who is a cause in life, not just an effect.
I think that's a great answer, Dad. And so for our next question, which I think has some similarities to that one and also to the first one that we answered. My childhood was unstable due to my parents' alcoholism, domestic violence, and constant relocations. I'm now in my late 30s, and I'm still living with family despite having good grades, a few career successes, and, at least I think, reasonably good social skills. I just can't seem to make the jump into true adulthood. My only attempt to move out in my early 30s lasted less than a week, intensifying my shame. I look functional from the outside and hide the struggle from most people. What steps would you recommend for somebody in my situation to finally transition to independent living? What might be keeping me stuck despite my outward signs of capability? Really interesting question, I thought.
It's a haunting question. And
Yeah. And the
let's be clear,
experience of many, many people these days.
I find myself wondering about the word family. They're living with family. Are they living with either or both of their parents, or maybe with a sibling, perhaps a relative? If they're living with one of or either of their parents, given the history, that would really stand out for me as, what's going on with that? To go the other way, maybe things have gotten better. The parents sometimes wise up over time. Sometimes drug and alcohol issues reduce sometimes as people get older. Then I also find myself wondering about, this doesn't sound like a person has a job. They seem financially dependent. Doesn't sound like they're dating.
The job part I'm not clear on. Just as a in terms of the context of the question, they talk about having some career successes and this not being so obvious from the outside. It's possible that this person is
maybe
doing
working.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder about all that. All that said,
Mhm.
Then we start thinking about small steps and building more of a life that's independent, that's
Yeah.
individuated, right? What might that be? And I would be interested in, wow, what gives you passion? What do you really like doing that's your own? What's your own, right? Uh, Maybe develop some things that are really your own. Doesn't have to be a new job or, a romantic relationship. Could be something like you get really interested in, I don't know, playing poker socially, right? Or swing dancing, or, some political cause, volunteering, your church, your synagogue, your temple, things like that. What's actually your own? Maybe a serious hobby. Get really good at coin collecting or macrame, something, that's your own. I'll just pause there while I keep thinking more about this. How would you reply to this
I
person?
think this is a great point that you're making here, Dad, because what's sort of inside of it is how do you do a good exposure for this kind of a problem?
Yeah. Step by step.
Step by step. How do
Mhm.
you create a graded approach where you can get the experience of something going well inside of this? Because what really stands out to me in the question is that they tried and it didn't go well. So they had that experience that I was kind of talking about last time. Like, what do you do when it doesn't go well? Because that just really enforces or really reinforces all of the narrative that you've created about yourself. I am the
Mm.
kind of person who cannot accomplish this. I am the kind of person who fails when I try to do this thing. And so that's the belief system that I think that any good solution would attack. And I'm not sure how to do a good exposure for this problem was part of the reasons that one of the reasons that I found the question really interesting. Um, I would wonder about some version of moving into a different living environment where you still had a degree of social support. So I'm wondering if there's a friend system that's going on. Would it be possible to live with other people as opposed to just living by yourself, which could be a really large step for this person? Is there extended family that would be more kind of palatable to you, that would make you feel more like a adult who is on your own, who is doing your own thing? Is there something that you could do in your work life or your hobby life that would make you feel more successful, or a goal you could set for yourself that would make you feel a little bit more independent? Um, could you try something on in kind of an unrelated area? Maybe this is not somebody. This is just an easy example. I use it all the time, and this may or may not be for this person. But maybe you're not an exerciser, but you decide, okay, I'm going to develop some kind of an exercise habit, both because moving is good and it makes you feel a little bit more motive in your life in general, but also as a way to demonstrate to yourself that you can do things that are outside of your comfort zone. So I
Ah,
would look for kind of other stuff that's
yeah.
on the edges of the comfort zone and see if you could develop an interest or a proficiency with it that would then kind of convince you that you're the kind of person who can do hard things. And maybe that would be a way to kind of backdoor this problem a little bit.
I love all that. I'm imagining myself into the mind, the being of this person. And intuitively, what comes forward is first fear. They're scared. And we're scared to leave the nest, understandably. It's scary about out there. So what do we need inside ourselves when we're scared to leave the the burrow, the den, right? The cave, the nest. What do we need? We need two things in particular. We need the support of others who will be with us as we step out into the world, emotionally, certainly, and even potentially physically. They will be with us as we move out into the world. And we need a sense of a good world to move out into. What's the compelling vision that you have passion for and you care about for the life you'd like to have, no longer living with family, and really develop that. I'm not hearing the development of that vision. I'm hearing it as more like abstract, as kind of a should related to where you are in the developmental trajectory, maybe with some guilt around it and some self criticism around it, rather than what do you like? What is it that you really, really like that you're trying to move toward? So I would highlight those two things in a context of compassion for oneself. Like, yeah, this is scary. Back to the freeze person. It's really important to bring compassion both to the B group dogs and to the experimenters who kind of had to drag the dogs through all that, but especially, of course, for the dogs compassion for them, and compassion for others and oneself who have been traumatized and developed learned helplessness and their freeze response in general. That's also a really important thing. I want a name for that one. But for this person, yeah, it's scary to leave the nest. And so, how can you help yourself? How can you empower yourself with companions who are going with you toward a brighter future?
I think that's a great answer, Dad. So we have at least one more question. We'll see how much time this one takes us. My daughter was recently diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and is now receiving treatment from a therapist. That therapist has mentioned that she could also be bipolar. I've read that these two conditions are often misdiagnosed for one another. As a worried mom, this is concerning for me because I've read that some treatments, like SSRIs, might work for one of these conditions, but be less effective for another. Could you shine some light on these diagnoses and possible treatments? What do you think, Dad?
It's a deep question. There are so called comorbid conditions. Sometimes people have two things. Let's also be really clear that psychiatric diagnoses are not like diagnosing someone with, let's say, a broken leg or a staph infection in their throat. Uh, these are fuzzy, and sometimes people don't exactly fit, one diagnosis or another. So the point of diagnoses is that, are they useful for us? That said, really briefly, it's definitely true that what characterizes a borderline personality type is instability of identity, instability of relationships, instability of emotional regulation, definitely instability, uh, instability of sense of self, instability of life behavior. Okay, so there's an attempt, to help them create more stability, both from the outside in and from the inside out. Great. Bipolar involves true manic episodes. True manic episodes. Now, what is it, bipolar 2 or something? That's more
Yes.
hypomanic.
Yeah.
Hypomanic to me is kind
More
of a
mild
fuzzy
mania. Yeah.
term. Where does adolescent excitement and intensity end, and where
Yeah.
does
And the
hypomania
hypomania begin. Yeah,
begin?
totally. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think about I don't know what, conductors of a symphony who are really just carried away by the music. Are they being hypomanic, during Beethoven's ninth, let's
Sure.
say?
Yeah. I think that, I mean, one of the ways that people talk about this is it environment appropriate? Is one of
Yeah,
the big qualifiers for this kind of stuff.
yeah,
Like, does it make
yeah,
sense based on the other stuff that's going on? Just as a quick bit of information about this for people, a truly manic episode, you're not functional. You are not able to
yep,
exist in a society, as we like to say, in the manner that a person would prefer to.
yeah,
So hypomania is kind of a version of that, but it's much more
yeah,
functional, much more mild. Yeah.
yeah. And it's actually worth people tracking in themselves. Um, Whether they move into kind of a hypomanic state in which maybe they're particularly a little grandiose,
Yeah.
a little
Revved up.
insistent, a little irritable in ways that are interpersonally problematic, maybe a little inflated in who they are, maybe less impulse control. There's a place for kind of noticing that. And it's nice to have a little label for it. But my favorite example of a manic episode, uh, without psychotic features. I've known manic episodes with psychotic features, but without, somebody basically contacted me and said, I think it was my dad. He has bipolar, and I asked him, "How do you know he has bipolar?" And he said, "Well, recently in an episode, he walked into a Trader Joe's grocery store, and he thought, oh, I better get some cheese, and he ended up, putting it in modern terms, walking out with about $2,000 worth of cheese. He just bought all the cheese in the store." Okay, that's a little bit of a manic episode of a certain kind. Okay. So then the question becomes, is this quote unquote just emotional instability, labile, affect, maybe to an extreme in a particularly borderline-ish kind of person? Or is this a true manic episode, which is characterized by things like pressured speech, flights of fancy, extreme grandiosity, extreme and often self-destructive impulsivity, great irritability when, if at all, thwarted or resist it in any way. That extreme quality, is that actually present when this borderline person, is being emotional, let's say? And
Mhm.
then is it followed by a crashing depression? Because it's bipolar, it's depression, real depression, not just, oh, I was such a fool, I feel terrible, but I mean clinical depression. So that's a bit of the differential. With regard to the medication, I'm not a psychiatrist. I know a lot about, neurochemistry and so forth, but I don't give professional opinions about medication. And I think that's definitely, worth tracking and being really careful about. And meanwhile, there's a lot to do that's not medication centered for either condition, and definitely if it's a dual diagnosis. There's plenty you can do from the mental health standpoint, the social support standpoint. Mindfulness-based interventions have a lot of, I think, benefit for borderline conditions, certainly, things of that sort.
So, in terms of talking a little bit more about treatments, I looked into the pharmacology of it because I was just curious about it. I'm
Ah,
extremely not a doctor.
yeah,
It turns out that SSRIs are actually sometimes prescribed for both of them, but they're not considered a frontline treatment for bipolar.
yeah,
I believe that the concern about that is because they are a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Hello, that creates more serotonin, and the concern is that that could lead to a manic episode for somebody.
yeah,
So that's why they're not always sort of a frontline treatment. But of course, we can't speak to this particular person, and those
yeah,
conversations that need to happen with a doctor. Um, in terms of the more mental healthy stuff, DBT is an approach to therapy that was created specifically for working with borderline personality. It's a really interesting approach. It has a lot of qualities that are very similar to aspects from ACT or aspects from other mindfulness based approaches to therapy, where you're really trying to increase psychological flexibility by being able to essentially hold different things as being true in your mind at the same time. So, what you see a lot in borderline in particular is what's called splitting or black and white thinking, where things are made either all good or all bad. And we want to have more flexibility inside of ourselves. And there's kind of this very rapid movement often from viewing other people as being either all good or all bad. And that's what is a feature of that kind of underlying instability. So we want to kind of help people build up the sense that, hey, you can be both good and have positive qualities and negative qualities at the same time. And just the fact that they have negative qualities doesn't make them all bad. And the fact that they have positive qualities doesn't make them all good. So these are just different approaches that people use to these.
That's great. I just had a couple final thoughts, just feeling my
Hmm.
way into this parent and also this kid, and it
Yeah.
sounds like a young adult, maybe a teenager. One is, what's it like to be us, let's say, present with someone who's borderline? And I deliberately use that language for me, which is less pathologizing than borderline personality disorder. What's it like to just be with them? Their hunger for approval and support, their instability, their oscillation between idealization and devaluation of you, let's say, as a parent. What's it like to be around that? And can you kind of hold your ground? So much of what Marsha Linehan, the founder of DBT, as you know, um, really talked about is just helping therapists and now certainly parents and friends and family members just to kind of hold their ground. Uh, I'm not, let's say, totally buying into what you're saying over there. On the other hand, I'm not rejecting you. I'm not withdrawing. I don't need to leave. You're not too much for me. That's a really important communication. Second, um, for the person themselves, it's tough to have so much instability. It's tough. It's tough to have your mood instability. It's tough to have identity instability. What do I want today? It's totally different than what I wanted yesterday for my life. It's hard. And so it really calls for compassion, and it calls for, as much as we can, creating stabilities that are not imprisoning, but are actually freeing, because they create more and more of a stable platform on which a person can launch into life and, pursue the goals and dreams that are personally meaningful. And then the last suggestion, to be blunt about it, is that given that it is tough to be unstable in this way, particularly mood instability is really tough, be aware of and vigilant about any kind of self harm. I believe that the rate of self harm, including lethal self harm, of all the psychiatric disorders is highest for people with a true manic depressive bipolar disorder. And so just, not to freak you out, but, be aware of that, including any kind of early indicators of that kind of thing.
I'm glad that you added that, Dad. I think that's a really good thing to mention to people here as part of this.
Yeah.
So we have one final question. I do think we got a little time for it. We might answer it, hey, a little quickly here. But I thought this was a really interesting one and had a little social commentary in it too, which I always enjoy. I'd love to hear your thoughts on modern friendship advice. There's so much online self help content telling us to only maintain friendships if you're mutually benefiting each other's growth, or to seek equal exchanges of energy and only say yes if it's a hell yes. As somebody who's often the more emotionally regulated person in my friendships, I worry that following this advice would restrict me to a tiny, probably very privileged circle of highly self aware people. It's hard enough to find friendships at all these days. What qualities actually matter in friendships, and how do you decide where to invest your time?
Well, because I'm an old guy and kind of cranky sometimes. I mean,
the running theme throughout this episode.
oh
Yes,
gosh,
go ahead, Dad.
I forget who it was. People have written about this, certainly about America, something like Narcissistic Nation or something like that.
Sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
just in
Yeah.
this is this, oh gosh, kind of a whiny, if it's not good, just drop them and leave.
Or if it's not
and-
great, just drop them. If it's
Yeah.
not exactly everything all the time, just drop them. You are, there's a whiff of the old, if you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best here. It's the whole
Ooh,
thing. Yeah.
That's nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
well said. On the one hand, on the other hand, not to get weird about it, but my dad did your grandfather and people in past generations lived in settings in which they needed to rely on other people a lot. They lived in physical proximity to others under harsh conditions with very little of a safety net. These days, good news is in many developed countries of the world, there's much more of a safety net. In America, unfortunately, it's becoming increasingly tattered, but still, we're not faced with Stone Age level challenges, let's say, or frontier America 150 years ago kind of challenges. But partly because people don't have to rely on each other so much, they don't necessarily learn to be reliable. And there can be kind of a focus on just taking for themselves rather than being aware of the degrees to which they're actually showing up for other people in reliable, dependable ways. And so, yeah, there are a lot of people out there, I think, who are kind of shiny objects. They're interesting, they're appealing, everything is fine with them as a friend, as long as everything goes their way and most of the traffic goes their way and they get most of the benefit. But if you need something from them, or you're having a bad day, or you've had a loss and they think you ought to get over it already, it's been 2 weeks now, boom, you start to realize that the depth of that reliability, the moral commitment to you and that other person was very, very shallow. And that's not good. So, what I look for in my friends is, first of all, do I enjoy being around them? And when I leave, do I feel bigger or smaller? If you're around some people and when you leave them, gosh, you really can't put your finger on what it was, but you walk away with more self-doubt than ever. You feel more inadequate than ever. Your life feels more meh than ever. Or there are other people you walk away and, you sit up straighter, you stand up straighter, your steps lighter, you feel more confident. Yeah, those are the people to be around. A friend is someone who will take you in. A friend is someone who will help you move. A friend is someone you can call and they're in the hospital. And, you may not come that night, but you're going to come the next day and see how they're doing. That's who our friends are. And I want to have friends like that. And I want to be that kind of a friend to them.
I think that's really well put, Dad. I would basically just echo everything that you've already said about it. I'm not sure if I have too much more original to contribute other than a real kind of skepticism toward that sort of self-help content in general, frankly. Grandiosity is a drug, and it is a seductive drug. And I just see so much kind of grandiosity in the kinds of things that this person was talking about in their question.
Yeah.
Not from that person, but just from the kind of discourse they're talking about online of like, oh yeah, you only be friends with people who are 100% quote unquote at your level. There's already an assumption there about what kind of level you're at.
Yeah.
It's just really easy for people to start to think that their shit don't stink. And I would just be extremely sensitive toward that. As a kind of general movement, as you've observed about me a lot, Dad, to kind of appreciate what our tendencies are and my natural tendency to sort of tack against whatever the bias is that we have as people. So we have a bias. Yeah, I'm a counterpuncher. So we have a bias as people to feeling like, yeah, I am special. Yeah, you're right. Wow, that person.
By the way, Forrest,
they really aren't as cool as I am. Forrest, all of that.
You are special.
Well, thanks, buddy. I think. See, here's the thing. I think I am special. I think you're special too. I think the people listening are also special. I think the punchline in all of this is there are a lot of special people in the world, and that's a realization that I hope that more people make sooner rather than later.
To tack on a codicil, if that's how to pronounce it, a last little PS here. The blob. What I mean by that is that we can resize our friendships so that we disengage.
Yes, great point. I'm glad we're doing this. Yeah.
Yep. So we're with another person and there's a lot about them we like. We connect about a lot of stuff, but good God, do they drone on about politics? And we're just tired of hearing it. So we just don't raise that topic anymore. Or if they bring it up, we very quickly find reason, oh, waiter, I'd like another serving of French fries, and like change the subject, right? We just don't go there. Or we realize that, they're impervious to helpful advice. So I'm just going to hang out and hear them tell me again about the same life situation with their, their bad roommate. And I'm going to listen just as their friend, but I'm not going to try to help them in any way because I've learned that's worthless.
I think you're so right. And I'm going to say something because I've already said one thing that I think is going to get me into trouble this episode. I'm going to double down and say another thing that I think is going to get me into trouble this episode. I think that being emotional vampired, so having somebody else like suck the emotional life out of you, is by and large your choice. With a couple of exceptions, with a few exceptions, which do exist. There are people out there who can just vampire anyone because that is how they are built. They are built different. They are a grade A emotional vampire. Most of the time when people are talking about like, oh, that person was such an emotional vampire or whatever, you're just describing having bad boundaries.
Yeah.
That's it. You're just
it's
describing
not all their fault?
No, you're just describing being poorly boundaried with this person. It's like if you were able to have better psycho-emotional boundaries, it would not be possible for them to emotional vampire you because you'd just be like, all right, cool, man. Yeah, all right, keep it moving. And then you engage with, my point in this is you engage with the relationship at the level that it fulfills you.
Yeah.
And there are very few relationships we're going to have in our life that are all fulfilling all the time. Very, very, very few. And if we just decide that anything that isn't all fulfilling all the time is like not a good investment of our energy, you're just not going to have a lot of relationships in life. And by the way, you're allowed to make that choice. If that's how you want to do it, more power to you. It's not how I personally choose to do things for me, in part because, as this person said, it's hard enough to make friends already. And I feel confident in my ability to draw those boundaries where I want to draw them. But I think that those are the traits that you're making, and you get to choose. Big theme on this podcast. You get to choose. What do you want to do about that?
I'm thinking also of something I realized when I was looking back on my career rock climbing, and I've had 4 primary climbing partners with whom I've developed lifetime friendships, each one of them. Although one of them is no longer with us, bless his memory. If I had met any one of them at a party, let's say, where I had a chance to sit down and interact and converse, I would not have pursued the friendship. But because we were in the trenches together, we were up against it together, we forged a bond that could become lifelong. And that's one way to develop deep friendships, where you work together on something important. You both have skin in it. And you come through for each other in that environment. So that's another piece of it too.
Let's just leave it there for the moment. I think that that's a great point, Dad, at the end here. Loved these questions. Thought that they were so clever and so interesting. And this was a really fun one to record with you. We've had some really fun mailbags recently, buddy. We've been getting some great questions from people.
I think it calls for a little more I don't know, spontaneity, heterogeneity
Yeah,
in
yeah.
us. We
We're
tend to be
bouncing
kind of
around a little
looser,
more.
like boing, a boing, a boing. Like what?
Totally.
Anyway,
Totally. I had a great time as usual answering questions with Rick. If you would like to have a question answered on a future episode of the podcast, you can find us at contact@beingwellpodcast.com and also on Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwell. The first question that we got was from somebody, a 20 some odd year old person who is having a hard time balancing their sense of their own potential with the fear and resistance that they experienced when facing the realities of adult life. And particularly, there was this kind of fear of hope, which is something that we've talked about on the podcast in the past. I particularly talked about it with Ross Allenhorn. That was a really cool episode. This really made me think of gifted kid syndrome, and that's what I focused on in my answer. And Rick emphasized aspects of it as well. When early on in life you were branded as being particularly bright with this great deal of potential inside of you, it's very easy to experience a kind of gap between that and the way that life actually ends up turning out for most people. And when you've built this identity as an achiever, as a unique person with special talent, trying in a weird kind of way is threatening. Because if you never try, you can't disconfirm that potential. You're always living in the world of, if I had actually tried, maybe I would have been able to live up to it. So the problem isn't that you're not gifted enough, it's that you have an effort problem. And for some people, they would just rather have an effort problem than have a giftedness problem, because that giftedness is much closer to their core identity. And I can speak to this from some experience. This was very much my experience as growing up. I was very much in that gifted kid category. And frankly, I think that while the spirit behind that kind of designation is like well intentioned and I get it, I think that it actually created a lot of problems for people later on in life. So, what to do about this? First of all, you validated the function. There's some protective avoidance going on here. And you can see that if you look at yourself. You can see the things that you're trying to defend yourself against. As Rick likes to say, what's the dreaded experience here? And how are you constantly bending away from little ways that you fear that you could kind of disconfirm that sense of talent inside of yourself? Then, as Rick mentioned, how can you come more and more into the present, more and more into a focus on the things that you're doing in the moment of doing them, and particularly the things that you like about what you're doing? Because if you like what you're doing, it's less about what you're going to get from it in the future, building this incredible pyramid or something like that, and much more about the enjoyment of the act itself. Like I was saying, chop wood, carry water. The second question was about performance anxiety, particularly about speaking a language. Rick had a lot of advice about this that all sort of orbited the idea of changing the focus in what the person is doing. Is the focus on speaking the language perfectly, or is the focus on communicating effectively? Are you outwardly focused on how people are going to appraise you, or are you inwardly focused on your own goals of doing as well as you can do inside of this program? You don't need to speak perfectly in order to communicate really effectively. The third question was about learned helplessness, and Rick gave a rundown of the research and history behind the term learned helplessness. The initial research was done on dogs. It was done with, in my opinion, like very questionable ethical standards. But the overall takeaway was that once helplessness had been conditioned into the person, or in this case, the dog, that was a part of that experiment, it was extremely difficult for the people who were conducting the experiment to convince the dogs that trying would eventually matter for them. And we can really take that lesson ourselves, right? We need many experiences of trying going well for us to disconfirm the pre-existing belief that if we try, we're going to fail and our trying won't matter. So this means that, first of all, we need to build up some kind of a pain tolerance here. We're going to have a lot of experiences of this feeling like crap before it starts to feel good. Second, we have to do everything we can to, again, focus on the process rather than the outcome. If we're enjoying what we're doing, even just a little tiny bit, some aspect of what we're doing, if we're enjoying that, we can get more focused on that as opposed to focusing on the rewards that we're going to get from whatever activity it is that we're participating in. And I think a part of this, which was also a part of some of the other questions that we got, is increasingly building up this sense of ourselves as a person who can do tough stuff, where yes, you pushed the boulder up the hill, and yes, the boulder fell back down the hill, but you pushed it anyways. It's not so much about the boulder staying up the hill, it's about the act of pushing it. And the more that we can kind of build up this sense of ourselves as somebody who pushes boulders up hills in a good way, like the boulder might fall, but guess what? You moved the boulder the first time around. That effort itself is valuable. And I think that sometimes we get so fixated on outcomes that we start ignoring the efforts that we've put into something. In some ways, it doesn't really matter to me whether or not somebody succeeds or fails in an effort. I really care about the fact that they gave an effort, period. The next question was from somebody who was experiencing basically a kind of failure to launch into their life. They were in their late 30s, if I'm remembering correctly, and they had had a hard time moving out from their kind of unstable and volatile home environment. And we were basically trying to figure out, how could this person do a form of exposure? What would be a way for them to do a more accessible version of this big move where they could experience some successes that might kind of counteract some of their previous experiences of failure? I think that this question is tricky, in part because it's a bit difficult to find a good exposure here. But some of the ideas that we had were finding some other areas of life where the person could find a little exposure. Can you engage in a hobby? Can you find some friends to live with? Is there extended family that could be a resource for you here? Is there some way for you to, again, really build up that sense of yourself as the kind of person who can solve problems and do difficult things? Because if you really feel that way about yourself, I think that you're going to find this problem a tackleable one. But if you don't feel that way about yourself, I think this one's going to be really tough. And I think that's kind of the crux, the underlying skill that's going to really support somebody's ability to step into that sense of themselves as a full adult. Because what's adulthood? Well, adulthood is about responsibility. It's about being the person who solves their own problems. We then got a question about the differences between bipolar and borderline personality disorder. This is a little technical. These things are often misdiagnosed for each other. One of the core points that Rick had was that diagnosis for mental health conditions is not as cut and dried as diagnosis of, say, a broken bone. It tends to be a lot more complicated than that. And frankly, misdiagnosis is pretty common in the mental health world. Really quickly here, for BPD, the emotional shifts that the person experiences are typically triggered by interpersonal stress or just external stress in general. And they tend to be both intense and fairly short-lived. So the person might have a rapid swing, for example, from idealization to devaluation. For people who experience bipolar disorder, their mood disorder tends to be more episodic in nature. So they experience mania, or in some cases hypomania, and then depression, and usually with periods of stable mood in between. But these mood states tend to be longer in nature, not always, but tend to be. And they also tend to be more what's called endogenous. In other words, they just kind of happen to the person as opposed to being so tied to external events. Final question was about modern friendship advice, and particularly the kind of friendship advice that focuses on getting as much as you give inside of your relationships. Only be friends with people who are at the same level that you are, who you can mutually grow with, all of that kind of stuff. And I do really appreciate the spirit of that advice. Relationships like that can be amazing relationships. But the reality is that not every relationship is going to be like that. And as Rick talked about during the episode, sometimes we have these friendships that we never would have expected, where maybe they're domain specific. You talk with a friend about this kind of group of things, but not that group of things over there. And there are subtopics where, frankly, it's really hard for me to disagree with somebody about them and continue to be friends with them. They're kind of line in the sand topics. But by and large, I think that an incredible relationship skill to cultivate is the ability to meet people where they're at. This doesn't mean that you're doing a lot of work inside of the relationship. This doesn't mean that you're feeling really drained or you're constantly rolling your eyes at the ridiculous things that somebody else is saying. It means you're able to smile and nod every once in a while. It means that you're able to get what you need out of relationships as a personal skill. You're able to move a conversation in the directions that you want to move it. You're able to draw healthy boundaries with other people in ways that protect your energy. And I do think, frankly, that a lot of the time when people complain about these kind of parasitic relationships, unless you're in an environment where you're just stuck with this person, it's a family environment, you can't easily disconnect. It's a business environment, it's really hard for you to get away from your boss who is just all consuming and annoying. But I think that by and large, an incredible skill to cultivate is the ability to get what you want from relationships, including from imperfect friendships. I have friends where I know that they're going to show up for me no matter what. They're going to take me in the way that Rick was talking about. And I have friends where, honestly, I'm not really so sure if that's the case. I don't know if they're going to do that kind of effort for me. I don't know if they're going to go out of their way in that way. But are they a fun hang? Yeah, they're a great hang. If we're at a dance convention together, absolutely we're going to shoot the shit in the corner. We're going to have an awesome 25 minutes, and then we're going to kind of shake hands and be on our way. It's all okay. We can have a kind of flexibility here. And I think that if you see what people actually do in real life, as opposed to what they talk about doing online, almost everybody does stuff that way. People understand that not every friendship is going to perfectly feed you all of the time. That's it for today's episode. As always, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. If you've made it this far and you somehow haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the show. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on pretty much every podcasting app. If you have a minute and you can leave a comment or a rating or a positive review of the show, we'd really appreciate it. It really does help us out. Until next time, again, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.